Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the Dole Institute of Politics for the program this afternoon. My name is Bella Koskell. I'm a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The SAB is a bipartisan group. As a member of the SAB, I get access to many great opportunities by being involved with the Institute. If you are a KU student and are interested in joining, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. At the end of the event, we will have time for you to ask questions of our guests. Please send your questions to dolesocial@ku.edu. That's DOLESOCIAL@ku.edu at any time during the program. That email will also be in the description box. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. This afternoon's program is closed captioned for the hearing impaired. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. John Hosler.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. Today is the first in a series of presentations by members of the faculty at Fort Leavenworth at the Command and General Staff College and School of Advanced Military Studies. And we are exploring a theme this year of military theorists. And throughout the year, we'll be doing different military theorists from different portions of history, all the way up until the present day. And so for today's lecture, we are starting off at the chronological beginning, at the earliest of these talks, which is in the European Middle Ages, in the medieval period. And I'll be talking today about a man by the name of John of Salisbury, who was a writer, a luminary, one of the great minds of the Middle Ages, and has been called by some people the best political mind before the rediscovery of Aristotle in the 13th century. So a very learned man and someone who is very well known in the medieval community, but whose work on warfare has, for the most part, for most of modern history, gone unnoticed, despite the fact that it was not unnoticed in his own day and in the centuries after. We've sort of forgotten about him. And so today I'm going to go through John of Salisbury's life a little bit, about his writings, and then talk about his military theory, as he spells it out in his different works, but in particular in one work that I'll get into in some detail. And hopefully the impression that you'll get is that there was substantial military theory in the Middle Ages, a period that is routinely castigated and sort of dismissed as having no original military thought. The idea being that the medieval writers simply drew everything they knew from ancient Rome, sometimes from ancient Greece, passed that along and never did anything very original themselves. And I hope today to show you that that actually is not the case. It's a misunderstanding of the period. And one of my missions as a professional, as a historian, is to try to get people to look a little bit more at the medieval theories. Because if we do believe that the past has lessons to offer us, we would certainly be foolish to ignore a period that's about 1,000 years in length and contains several notable writers. So let's begin and take a look at John. Right? John of Salisbury, you'll probably recognize the name. It's from Salisbury, England. But at the time, he was born in a location outside the city known as Old Sarum, a very popular tourist destination these days, where you can see the ruins of the church and the old fortifications in the area where he grew up. Between 1115 and 1120, we don't exactly know when he was born, but sometime around there. Right? Educated at Exeter, so further to the west and the south, and then afterwards at Paris in what we would call sort of the college days. He went to cathedral school in Paris and studied under some of the most notable minds of his age. One of them being the famous Peter Abelard, if you've heard of Abelard and Eloise and the love letters shared between them. Abelard was one of his teachers. So this is a man who studied at a very high level and really tuned his mind in learning of the classics and in contemporary texts. After leaving Paris, John made his way back to the British Isles and became a clerk in the household of the archbishops of Canterbury. Canterbury being the metropolitan of England, being the archbishopric and having the churchmen of the highest standing. This was a prominent position. The archbishops of Canterbury are the ones who would perform the coronation rite on English kings, right? So this is a place of a very high position where he was in contact with the movers and shakers of his day. And one thing we know about John is that throughout his life, he had tremendous contacts at the highest levels. And not only in England, but in France, in Italy, throughout Europe. He knew popes, he knew cardinals, he knew archbishops and bishops, magnates of the realm, prelates of the church. He knew kings. He corresponded with the kings of England and the kings of France and the princes of Wales. So this is a man who's very highly connected, right? After his service ends at Canterbury, it ends in 1170 with a little bit of tragedy. Those of you who've heard the name of Thomas Becket will recognize him as the martyred saint who was killed in his own cathedral in 1170. We just had the anniversary, the 850th anniversary of his death a few days ago. When the archbishop is killed, Thomas is gone, and John finds new employment at Exeter Cathedral, where he worked as a treasurer for 6 years. And then afterwards, he was elected a bishop, but not in England, in France, where, as I mentioned, he had a lot of connections, and he became the Bishop of Chartres in his later years. And that's where he died. And he left a list of his will at Chartres. We know what he had in his possession at the end of his life: books, artifacts, writing instruments, those sorts of things. And as you can see on the picture, is still remembered in France today. And so he was one of those people who wasn't just relegated to a particular monastery in a particular part of the Isles where he wrote in semi-obscurity only to be known later. This is a man who traveled the world, who went to Rome and who knew all of the principles that he wrote about. He's also an author. Now, John is in some degrees known as a letter writer. You see about 325 personal letters down there. Part of this is because he's in great correspondence with a lot of his contacts, but also it's because he's penning letters for those archbishops of Canterbury. Very often you'll see a letter from Thomas Becket and you wonder, well, did Becket write this or did John write this, right? So a lot of his time is in writing correspondence. But when he's not doing his official duties, he was writing several other works, and you see them all on the screen there. They amount to thousands of pages of text. To acquire them all, actually, it takes a little bit of hunting and a lot of money these days, because the editions of these can be difficult to find. So you see a lot of variation there in his corpus of works. You see the Metallogicon, a defense of education in the liberal arts. He wrote a history, the Historia Pontificalis, which includes a history of the Second Crusade, of other things. He wrote 2 saints' lives, a life of St. Anselm and a life of St. Thomas, and then even some poetry and some court satires. So this is a man with a sense of humor and kind of that wry wit that's required to look at goings on in politics and be able to express concepts about them in sort of a joking, almost mocking manner in order to teach lessons. So he's a very interesting author to read because his genres are all over the place. But of all these books, by far the most famous of them is the one listed at the top that I have underlined, the Polycraticus. That is his crowning achievement, and it is the book that he is most remembered by because it contains, among other things, a very famous episode in the history of political thought. In Polycraticus, John puts forward a notion that we call today tyrannicide, in which he makes an argument about the justness of killing a tyrant and whether or not the killing of a tyrant is permissible in the eyes of God. It's that part of Polycraticus that has been seized upon for centuries and used. People like Boccaccio read it. People like Dante read it. The great humanist writers of the Italian Renaissance read it. And you can take it all the way up until the present day. I have a text of one of Fidel Castro's speeches, and he makes a reference to John of Salisbury's Policraticus talking about tyrannicide, right? So this is where his fame really comes from that, that notion that here's a guy who served Thomas Becket, the famous martyr, was there when Becket died, and also authored this treatise about this famous topic, right? Now, the problem is that if you read Polycraticus, it's huge. It is very big. And if you go through it, it can be quite a complicated book because John tends to jump from subject to subject to subject. I've labeled it a political treatise here, but you could call it so many other things. You could call it a moral treatise, for example. Some people like to throw it into that genre of literature that's sort of the advice for princes, or in the Middle Ages was called the mirrors for princes genre, where the prince would read it and learn lessons about how to act in good government, right? It's very similar to A Man We'll Meet Later. If you've heard of the famous book, The Prince by Machiavelli, right? The same sort of thing. Here's some useful advice for you, right? So he is well known. He's not obscure in name, and he's not obscure in works. He is a famous name. What is not well known is the other parts of Polycraticus that refer to warfare. And that's where I've been spending a lot of research over the past few years, looking at what he says in this book and how does it relate to the waging of war. So here we have Polycraticus. This is a page from one of the illuminated manuscripts of the Polycraticus. You can see the beautiful gold leaf and the drawing of what appear to be dragon or griffin wings there. Polycraticus, loosely translated in his meaning as he has it in his text as frivolities of courtiers and the footprints of philosophers. And you can get from that title a little bit of the sense, as I was talking about, sort of the gentle mocking, right? Courtiers, the people who run about the court seeking the ear of the king and the powerful, right? All of the frivolities and the nonsense they get into. And then the philosophers who run around thinking deep thoughts and dropping ideas and just leaving their footprints almost like in the sand. Is anybody even going to see them? And so he's sort of jesting with himself and with others as he's writing. Polycraticus is in 8 separate books, and there is an enormous amount of information within all of those books. Right? Different books talk about different things. Tyrannicide is in one book. There are lots of other subjects in the other books, right? But in particular, the book that drew my attention was book 6. In book 6 of Polycraticus, it contains a subtitle, The Armed and Unarmed Hand of the Commonwealth. A couple of things should draw our attention there, right? The fact that he's using commonwealth, which is kind of an odd term. He's living in the 12th century. You would expect him to talk about maybe the monarchy, right? The kingdom, or even perhaps a duchy or a county, but he's talking about a commonwealth. He's thinking about the people therein. And the armed and unarmed hand, the notion that a government or a people, that there's different aspects to it. Some that involved things that are unarmed, in which you think of words and laws and concepts and regulations, but then also the armed hand, which is soldiers and the making of war. And so it's that armed hand of the Commonwealth that initially drew my attention when I was looking through it. And I said, there might be something interesting in here. And then as it turns out, there is more than that. The entire book talks about the waging of war and offers what I feel is a coherent military theory. And so when I asked myself the question, why is John sort of neglected in the history of theorists? If you were to ask a military historian, who are the great theorists in history, and they'll go down the line naming people and skip John, it may not be because they're trying to exclude him. It may simply be because they've never read him, because his military theory is buried in the middle of a huge book about politics. So who would find it there? Who would go looking for anything there? It's kind of an obscure task. And then when you get there, you have to wander through John's references to other works. He is what I would call a humanist of the 12th century. And I'll talk about that a bit more as I go along. But he has in his mind the notion that there are lessons in the past that can not only be learned, but that can be utilized in the present. Going back to the great authors of his day and pooling information in order to turn it into something useful for the modern waging of war. And not just the waging of war, everything else he talks about. And I've given you here a breakdown of the sources that he uses. These are just the sources he uses for his warfare passages, for the martial passages. He uses other things in other realms, talking about politics and morals and philosophy and these sorts of things. But here you can see the range from the Bible, Old and New Testament, Greco-Roman sources, and then the patristic sources, the church fathers, the early church fathers. I should point out, you see a lot of Roman authors there, and you see some Greek authors. As far as we know, John did not know how to read Greek. So if he's reading a Greek author, it's probably in a translated version that he found. So anyway, he's got all of these sources. So you have to kind of tear through them, because he's going to pull one out and say, well, as Lucan said, ... And you have to sit there and say, well, is he transmitting some martial concept that Lucan said? Or is this something that he came up with and is just using Lucan as a footnote, right? As a reference, as a piece of evidence to bolster his argument. There's a lot of sorting that you have to go through. It gets very complicated, right? If you put in the work, you can do it. If you don't, though, it's very impenetrable when you first pull it open. And I would say this is very opposite to a guy like Machiavelli, who hardly cites any of his sources. He'll tell story after story after story, and we're still very ill-informed about who Machiavelli's sources even were. With John, you never have that problem. He always tells you who he's taking from. And so that's kind of nice. You know what the sources are, and you can go and check what he's saying against what his ancient source says. And if you do that, you can figure out what is original to him and what is taken from somewhere else. Now, all of that said, when I first started doing this work several years ago, there was some resistance in some other medieval scholars I talked to, because Polycraticus had never really been treated like a military text before. And it goes even deeper than that. John is kind of a frustrating guy because he says himself that it's not a military text. And you can look at this top quote here, right? Where he says, "It's not my purpose to write a treatise on the art of war." So the author himself is saying, I am not writing a handbook for the military. That's not what I'm doing. And then he goes further and says, if you want a handbook for the military, here's all these other guys you could read, right? Go read Cornelius Celsus, read Vegetius, read these other people. They know what they're talking about. Don't read me, right? So at first blush, if you're reading this, you say, oh, well, never mind. It's not a military text. And, the guy on the screen has no idea what he's talking about. But as I like to tell my students sometimes, I wouldn't be a very good historian if I wasn't skeptical of my sources. One of the first things you learn when you do medieval studies is not to trust most of the things that you read. You have to be very, very skeptical. And so John can protest and he can say, I'm not writing a treatise on the art of war, but do I have to believe him? Maybe I'll believe him after I do some investigation. Because what it seems like to me is the further you go into the book, you'll notice this is in book 2, so it's very early on in Polycraticus. As you go further, by the time you get to book 6, it turns out that what he is doing is exactly writing a treatise on the way of war. So it's like he doth protest too much, right? I'm not doing it with this hand. And on this other hand, he goes ahead and does it, right? And you get an inkling to this before you even get out of book 2 and chapter 6. You see at the bottom where he says, look, I'm not hostile to the military. I defend it, right? I justify it. It's a praiseworthy profession. He has strong opinions about it. They're going to come out. You just have to be patient with the book, and you have to keep going through the pages and get through all of the other stuff in order to get to it. And that can be kind of frustrating. John starts talking about the zodiac. He starts talking about the Romans and how they were superstitious and how silly it is. And you start wondering, when am I going to get to the good stuff? But by the time you get to book 6, for people who are inclined to study military things, the good stuff is waiting there for you. Right. Now, that said, we do have to admit that John is awfully influenced by the ancient guys, by the ancient authorities that he's using for his sources. I've got the 2 most prominent up there. What I did is I went through his entire corpus of works, the Polycraticus, and then every letter he ever wrote and every other minor work he wrote. And I looked for citations to these 2 famous Roman authors. These are kind of the 2 most famous Roman military theorists. Sextus Julius Frontinus, who wrote in the 1st century AD, a book called Stratagemata, Frontinus was an administrator in Rome. He actually ran the aqueducts, oversaw aqueduct operation. He wrote a book about aqueducts. He was really into water. And John quotes him 39 times throughout all of his works. Right? And he always says, when he's quoting him, he says, as Frontinus says, as the Strategimata says. He doesn't make any bones about it. And then there's Vegetius, or Flavius Vegetius Renatus, who wrote a book called the Epitome Rei Militaris, commonly called the De Re Militare. We don't know exactly when he lived, 4th or 5th century. There's a lot that's obscure about him. We know he was a Christian writer, but the rest of his biography is a little obscure. John references Vegetius 13 times. Okay? So what some historians of strategy have done is they've looked back, the ones who have chance to look at John, and they said, I know what this guy is. I've seen this type of guy before because there's people like this in the Middle Ages. He's a man who passes along ancient knowledge. He's a compiler, right? This is a guy who went into libraries and he copied passages of different books and just threw them in his book to sort of pass them along to posterity, right? You can make this accusation because there's an awful lot of medieval writers that did exactly that. And it wasn't just the purview of writers, but sometimes it was just monks copying texts in the scriptorium, where they would just take bits and pieces of books that they had or borrowed, and they would compile them into books for posterity, just passing it along, not commenting on the knowledge. So I can see how people would write him off and say, oh, well, he's not the one who's important. It's Vegetius who's important. It's Vegetius because he's passing along Vegetian knowledge. Okay, right? You can make that argument. I'm going to disagree with that as we go along because there are differences between the authors, but you can move forward with that if you like. There's a problem though. Before you even get to the inside of John's text, there's something that we medievalists have to pay attention to called the manuscript tradition. Right? You have to look at manuscripts of these authors. We oftentimes don't have original ancient copies of guys like Frontinus. What we have are very often medieval copies made by monks in much later centuries. They preserve the knowledge of the past, and those original books are gone. I mean, the Bible is a great example of this, right? The reason we have the New Testament and the way it got passed along, right? So what about John in the manuscript tradition? Well, I found some manuscripts through my study which show a very interesting thing. There are a lot of manuscripts of Vegetius, a lot of them, hundreds of them. Not as many of John, but there are plenty of manuscripts of Polycraticus. Right? Sometimes, however, you find them bound together in the same codex. So you have manuscripts that are put together in a covering and bound together for some reason or another. Right? There are 3 of these that I've found. There's a 4th one that's too fragmentary. I didn't even bother to mention it today. But there's 3 of these that I found where you have Vegetius's work, which was undoubtedly highly influential in the Middle Ages, right? And remained highly influential into the early modern period, in the early Republic in America and even beyond. But 3 of these codices where the Polycraticus is bound up with the De Re Militare of Vegetius. Right? And you can see there the first manuscript, the Vatican Latinus, MS 4497, right? Where you have Polycraticus actually starting off the book, or starting off the codex, and then you have Vegetius put in right after him. Same thing happens in the second manuscript, right? MS 114. Polycraticus and Vegetius together. Here's where it starts to get more interesting. They're in the same calligraphy. They're written in the same hand, which means the scribe who copied them was the same scribe. Same person copied both books. That has to raise a question in your head saying, why would that scribe put these 2 books together? Why would they do that? Well, there's a number of answers, right? You can speculate, and we don't know because that person is dead and we can't ask him or her, right? But it does tickle the brain a little bit. And then if you go further to a manuscript held in the Netherlands, manuscript KB 78, which is housed in The Hague, I got a chance to look at this a few years ago, you find something even more curious. Not only is John of Salisbury paired with Vegetius, but they're also paired with Frontinus's books. So you have 2 of the classic Roman military manuals bound together, and right in front of them you have John of Salisbury's Polycraticus. Very interesting. I make the argument that these were bound together for a specific purpose, that they were put together because they are all books with military content. And if you read Polycraticus, you can't but help but see the parallels between them, because John is quoting from those other two books. And again, that third codice there, that is all written in the same calligraphy. It's all by the same scribe, right? So my theory is he's putting together books that are the same. So that's one of the first marks there, saying that, maybe people did recognize John as an authority. Okay? We'll get to more of that later, about whether or not John has original thought, or if it's just all Vegetius, right? Like some people say. And some of the items here are going to be germane to that, right? But for now, I want to take you through Polycraticus book 6. I mean, what is the theory that John has? If he is such of an interesting military theorist, what does he have to offer the profession of arms? What is his martial content? Right? This is a list of the material found within Polycraticus book 6, just book 6. He has military content in other places in his corpus, in his letters, in his history. There are other places where he talks about the military craft and gives advice, but this is the most concentrated in this book in the Polycraticus. And you can see the diversity of subjects that he goes through. And these are not necessarily just kind of drive-by, pop in, we'll talk about these things and move on. Some of these have extended discussions. Right? Now, framing all of it is his military lexicon, the terminology he uses. I was curious about this because he drops all of these different Latin terms for arms and armor and generals and formations and wars and horses and all of these things. And I thought to myself, well, maybe he's taking all of these terms from Roman literature, right? Which would be the easy thing to do. I read in Cicero these various notions about this reference to a spear, to a sword, and I'm just going to copy the term from Cicero. I mean, that would make sense, right? So what I did is I looked at contemporary documents from the 12th century, royal documents, as in edicts coming from the king, laws being passed from the royal court that talk about warfare. And what I found is that John's lexicon matches up with the lexicon in operation during his day. He's using the same terms that the King of England used, that the king's knights used, that the barons used. The terminology is the same. He is up to date. So in that regard, maybe he's not just taking from his sources. He seems to know something about contemporary practice. Okay, so that kind of overhangs all of this. When you get to these discussions, his terminology is quite accurate. It's contemporary with the events going on in his day. John offers a definition of Christian soldiery, what a Christian soldier should be, how a Christian soldier should act, what is their duty to God, what is their duty to king, what is their duty to the church, to the people. He goes through very specifically, if you're going to be a warrior, here are the things you must do. And in this, he's riffing off of the New Testament. There's a famous line where the Roman soldier asks John the Baptist, what should I do? And John the Baptist says, be content with your pay. The idea being that it's okay to be a soldier, but don't do more than that. Don't be egregious. Don't take from anybody else. And John operates around those same lines, right? You can be a soldier, you can be a Christian and be a soldier, but here are the rules you got to live by. It's sort of a modern code of professionalism for the 12th century. Okay? Then he moves into soldiers writ large. So not just the individual soldier, but soldiers in general, and talks about how do you put together an army? How do you identify good soldiers out in the countryside? Once you've identified them, how do you recruit them? Once you recruit them, how do you enroll them in the profession of arms? How do you train them? And his training is not simply about thrusting with a spear or shooting a bow, but in mastering the weapons for their position, learning how to ride a horse, learning how to build a camp, how to go on the march, how to carry supplies, all of those sorts of things. And he offers some interesting advice about how to do this. He says, if you're going to do this, you need to train. And you need to drill. Repetition over and over and over. He suggests that his commanders drill their soldiers. Now, one of the the myths of the Middle Ages is that medieval armies were these big unwashed masses, right? You've seen it in the movies before. These are hordes of barbarians clashing together with no order whatsoever. And the thought is generally that there was no training, there was no drill. They fought for a couple months because they had to, and then they went back to their farms and they didn't really know much, okay? Now, whether or not that's the case, what John is suggesting is something very different. He's saying if you're going to have armies, you have to bring them and train them, and you have to drill them and make them practice to make sure they know what they're doing so they can work with each other on the battlefield. That notion of drill is generally held to have only become a thing much later in history, 16th century, 17th century. We talk about folks like Maurice of Nassau later on down the line who institute drill in the armies in the Low Countries. John is suggesting drilling hundreds of years beforehand. Now, he's not a military man, so this is theory, right? Nobody's taking his advice and putting it into practice, but he's got that notion that drill is important. That moves into discipline as well. Something else we typically think of in the early modern period, right? If you're drilling your soldiers, what do you do if they disobey? What do you do if they flee the battlefield, if they desert? What do you do if on the march, they start going into people's houses and ransacking them for supplies, or gleaning from the fields when they're not allowed to, theft and rapine along the march? What do you do for those sorts of things? John is a firm believer in military discipline. So not only do you have to train these soldiers and drill them, but you have to correct them when they fall out of line. They have to fear the commander. They have to fear his wrath so that they obey, which will make them better soldiers and help them avoid, in his Christian context, help them avoid sin, right? So that they don't commit sins while they're on campaign. Here's another one that's typically thought of later: military pay. John of Salisbury proposes that soldiers be paid directly from treasury. Now, most times you'll hear people talk about the Middle Ages and they'll say, oh, well, they're operating because they own a fief and they owe the king's service, or there might be mercenaries who receive some kind of pay, or they sack a town and that's where they get their pay from, right? What John's saying is if you want good soldiers who are going to train well and show up for campaign and stay on campaign, you have to give them regular paychecks. Obviously not a check like we have today, right? You have to give them regular pay. That idea, most people say regular standardized military pay, that didn't come around again for centuries later, right? It actually does come much earlier than most people know. It comes in the 13th century in England, in the reign of Edward I, where you start to get these disbursements for pay, right? But it's an innovative idea during John's time, and he's pushing it forward. Right? Sustainment, logistics, transportation on land and over sea. He talks about different kinds of ships, different kinds of horses, mules, carts, wagons, how much the soldiers should carry on their backs, how much should be brought in a supply train. He talks about the criticality of maintaining logistics pipelines so that you can move sustainment materials up to where the soldiers are. And then that coincides with his discussion on movement and maneuver. How do you move armies around? And he's got all kinds of precautions. Don't take them through this kind of landscape. If you go through a mountain pass or a ravine, you're going to be in danger of getting ambushed. If you go through a broad field, here's the problem. If you encounter rivers, here's some other problems, right? So he's conceptualizing how armies move and how armies operate. It's interesting because as far as we know, John was never present with an army. He's not getting this from his direct experience. It's not like he's looking on and seeing soldiers and saying, oh, I saw this go right, I saw this go wrong. Instead, he's getting it from his texts, and then he's getting it from his interviews with the people that he's talking to, and with conversations he's having, and from reports of the military events of his day. So he's sort of taking that stuff ripped from the headlines, and he's translating it on the page in the light of the different kinds of things that he is reading about in his sources. When it comes to battle, John has a number of recommendations for how to engage in battle. And since he never engaged in battle, these are the ones where we kind of arch an eyebrow a little bit and say, is that really how it works? But nonetheless, he's trying to give advice that seems legitimate to him. Interesting enough, he talks about regular battle, so lining up in formation, charging at the enemy, when to commence. But he also talks about irregular battle, ambushes, particularly when he's talking about warfare in Wales and what happens to the English kings when they go into Wales and they get hit by these skirmishers who are hiding in the trees, who are attacking from points unknown. So he's kind of covering different sorts of battles as he's moving along, and he's offering different tactics. The tactical suggestions are not the most, I would say sophisticated. They're not. They're pretty basic. They're written by somebody you would say, I don't think he's seen a battle before. I mean, that's what you would conclude, right? But he does talk about infantry and cavalry, and he frowns on the use of missile weapons. He doesn't find that to be as useful or as honorable a way to fight. And here you can kind of take him with a grain of salt. Same on siege warfare. He's got some things to say. It's nothing innovative. It's kind of the general stuff that goes on in his day. Right. So I'm not trying to propose here that John is some kind of master of innovation and talking about, ahead of his time on everything. He's not. He is ahead of his time on some things, though. On some things. When it comes to particularly the soldiers themselves, how do you handle your soldiers in terms of training, drill, discipline, paying them, finding them, recruiting them, all of those sorts of things? He is on the leading edge there. If you move into the more strategic realm, John has a lot of things to say there as well. He's got a commentary on war and policy that I'll get into a little later that we call the body politic, this philosophical conception of the body of the government and of the people as parts of a body. And in that, he talks about the relationship that war and policy has. He has a fairly extended discussion on this that's well known by political scientists, right? And then finally, I would say that all of these concepts, I mentioned that he drops an awful lot of his evidence when he writes. All of these concepts are accompanied by historical anecdotes where he'll say something like, marching through marshy terrain. Hey, there was a guy who did that in ancient Rome, and here's what happened to him, or it's just an anecdote. But then very often an exempla, a series of exempla, or individually an exemplum. An anecdote that is not just there to pass along a story or to laugh at or giggle at, but an anecdote that contains useful information for change, right? Here's an example of someone who did that, and here's a way we can avoid doing that in the future. In other words, using the past, not just relating the past. And that's typically something we put at the feet of Renaissance humanists much later in the period. Not in the 12th century, but in the 12th century, we have John doing this. When it comes to strategy, I think John puts forward a definition of strategy. It's one he wrangles out of his sources. And as I mentioned before, the work that a scholar needs to do is to try to figure out what is he taking from these sources and what is his own, right? So he quotes Valerius Maximus, the Roman writer, who says that strategy is a laudable part of cunning. And he says, that's okay. And then he quotes from Frontinus, all these things achieved by a commander. And he says, yeah, that's part of it. And then he says, but thinking about this, here's what I think it really is, right? Activities pertaining to military science, a much broader notion, right? That there's this thing called military science, and understanding all of the stuff done within it, that's strategy. People can disagree on that. Historians of strategy are notorious for disagreeing on their on the definitions, right? But John puts that forward, right? The idea that these activities pertaining to military science. And then he lays out what he means by this. He offers what he calls his keys to military science, his keys. And you can see a quote here. This is not from Polycraticus. It's from one of his other books, right? Saying that I know some arts. I've learned from other people, but I've got information on some other arts, and I'm going to pass that along. And notice what he's talking about, right? The military. He's got information of it, and he says, note, I have ready the keys. I've got the keys, and I'm now going to pass them along. Remember how he claimed he wasn't going to write a military treatise? All of a sudden, it sounds like in another book, he's talking about writing a military treatise. Metallogicon, by the way, is written, it's published in the same year as Polycraticus. These books come out at the same time. But there's the keys: study, discretion, and limitation. Study, the study of history, looking back at past campaigns, at past commanders, at past battles, and learning what you can from there. That's number one. A good general is an educated general. discretion. Once you have that knowledge, apply it in the right ways, maintain secret plans so that others don't know what you're doing, and be a good example to your soldiers. So operating with discretion. Then finally, limitation. Limitation. John would be today a proponent of what we would call limited war. You fight for predetermined objectives. You find out what you want to fight for. You fight for them. Once you've got them, the war is over, right? He has a quote where he says in Polycraticus, "To conquer is good, but to do more than conquer is odious." The idea being that if you keep fighting when the war is over, when you've reached your objectives, bad things are going to happen. Now, the term we use in modern parlance of center of gravity, he didn't have this kind of terminology, but for John, it would be the enemy army, right? And everything he says is directed towards defeating the enemy army to reach your policy objectives. In that sense, he's suggesting what Napoleon would go out and do in the 19th century. Go out and destroy the enemy army. Right? So it's an interesting notion. Now, okay, so what? Why does that matter? John's thought comes around in the 12th century. He dies in 1180. It is commonly thought that the first great post-Roman military theorist is Niccolò Machiavelli, who dies in 1527, and who wrote a book called The Art of War. And what I found is that a lot of the great stuff that Machiavelli talks about that is so celebrated as new, as innovative, or even if not purely innovative, but at least taken from the Romans and put forward as an example of how we can change in the modern era, that John of Salisbury actually talks about most of the things Machiavelli does, right? So for example, we have that first bullet, right? The synthesis of ancient and contemporary military, right? Via the use of exempla, right? This is what John does. You use an example from the past, an exemplum, to obtain knowledge by doing a critical comparison. Here's what the ancients did. Here's what we do. Here's what we can learn from the contrast. Here's how we can learn from the critical study of history. John does this hundreds of years before Machiavelli. I've read several authors who have said that Machiavelli was the first one to do this in a military context, and it's simply not true. John of Salisbury beat him to the punch. The linkage of the political and the military spheres, this conception of the body politic. John says that the Commonwealth is a body, and it has a head, which is the government, and it has an arm, which is the law, that's the unarmed hand, but then it has another arm, which is the armed hand. There is a linkage between the military and political spheres, and they work together, and he's got a long discursus about how they help each other. Again, that's something Machiavelli puts forward, was thought to be innovative on. John beats him to the punch. And then finally, the idea of having educated leaders who read history, who read theory, who read literature, who read things so that they can learn, right? And you can see one of his famous quotes there: "An illiterate king is a crowned ass," right? You put a crown on a donkey, it's not worth much, right? That's the worth of a king who doesn't read. And then he complains about his own time, right? He says, look at the princes of our own day. They never read anymore. And surprise, surprise, look how badly we've done in war. Again, that's something that Machiavelli urges, not just in his book, Art of War, but also in The Prince. The idea that if a general is not actually at war, he should be reading about war. The one bit that Machiavelli does not have in his, that Machiavelli has in his skill set that John does not comment on, is this famous notion of the citizen militia. Machiavelli takes that from the Roman Republic, the idea that the best kind of army would be one drawn from the people. John of Salisbury has very little to say about militias, a few passing references, not much. So again, I'm not claiming that John does everything that Machiavelli does. But what I am claiming is that if we're saying Machiavelli is innovative, and virtually everyone does, then you have to look a little further back and say that John is in that tradition and saying things before the great Italian wrote them down in the 16th century. That raises other questions. If John of Salisbury preempted guys like Machiavelli, did he preempt anyone else? Well, it's interesting if you look at people who quote Polycraticus, who use John's information on the armed hand of the Commonwealth and on training and on pay and all of these ideas, you find this interesting intellectual lineage. Thomas Aquinas uses him for this purpose. Marsilius of Padua, Christine de Pizan, a female theorist and justly famous for it, who quotes heavily from Vegetius, also uses John of Salisbury. right? And on down the line you go. A king of Portugal quotes Polycraticus. Niccolò Machiavelli is preempted, and I've argued before, probably also uses John, although, as I said, he never cites his sources. Justus Lipsius, the great master who taught generals like Maurice of Nassau, he cites John of Salisbury. And most recently in my study, I have found a copy of the Polycraticus in 2 18th century libraries. One of them is in the library of a man by the name of Charles de Rohan, the Prince of Subiza, who fought at the Battle of Rosbach, and the other in Frederick the Great's library, the great king of Prussia, who we very often look to in terms of inspiration for concepts of limited war, and guess what else? The importance of training, drilling, and disciplining soldiers. And that's a line I have yet to track down all the way, but it's an exciting find for me. So my argument would be that John was keying in very early to some of these things that would become quite important in the history of early modern and eventually modern European warfare. Finally, we need to get to the John of Salisbury who, right? And before I start this, I would throw out that I'm going to make some final remarks about this. And if you have questions for me during the Q&A, you can please send them to me, as was introduced by Ms. Koskell in the beginning, right? The email address is dolesocial@ku.edu, dolesocial@ku.edu. If you have questions, please email them in. They will be sent to me and I'll be pleased to answer them. So we get back to this idea of John of Salisbury who. How can it be that he is such a mystery? If he has this material that is on the leading edge, that is preempting intellectually works on the martial craft written much later in much later centuries, then how can it be that he's been so buried and so forgotten for so long? Right? I have an assortment of ideas on this, but I'll offer 3 for your consideration today just to kind of chew on. Right? Number 1, I'm going to blame another Italian for it, a man by the name of Francesco Petrarch. Right? Petrarch is from where we derive this concept of the so-called Dark Ages. And I'm sure you've heard that term before, right? The Dark Ages. Medieval historians hate this term, right? It implies that after the Roman Empire fell, Europe descended into darkness and nobody read and nobody wore fancy clothes and nobody built any interesting architecture. And life was just nasty, brutish, and short, right? Petrarch is the man who kind of kickstarted that during his time. And you can see his quote there. And he's talking about the darkness is there, but once it disperses, right, then the light can come out again. And notice he says our descendants can come out again in this light. So for the future, everything will be great. Petrarch considered himself basically the best poet between ancient Rome and his age. A little conceited, right? Well, this idea of the Dark Ages is omnipresent. You hear it all over the place, right? And if you go into it with the idea that, well, the Middle Ages were this period of darkness with nothing interesting going on, well, then of course you're not going to look there for innovative material, right? Why would you? Ancient Rome's got great stuff, and maybe the Renaissance has great stuff, but that period in between, yeah, nothing there, right? So I think that whole, kind of falls over everything. And I'll read military history texts and they'll say, well, nothing really changed in the Middle Ages. They just kept doing things the way the Romans did. Not accurate, but that Dark Ages overshadows everything. Right? Second, there's some confirmation bias going there. There is a notion, again, when you talk to historians of strategy, that what the Middle Ages had at their disposal was Vegetius, that they had the epitome re militaris, the de re militari, and that's what they used. And they figured that they had that, and why do you need anything else? You just make copies of Vegetius and you just keep doing the things that he said. And they see all of these manuscripts of Vegetius. It kind of makes sense. They're in every library, right? He's being quoted all over the place. But if you go into it with the idea that the Middle Ages only used Vegetius, that's your confirmation bias. You're going to ignore evidence to the contrary. And I've got an example from F.L. Taylor, who basically says this, right? Says they didn't improve anything. There's nothing to see here, right? The problem is there is a lot to see there. But you have to go looking for it. And therein lies the third problem. How do you go looking for it? This is a period with a wild array of genres that are, many of them, unfamiliar to the modern mind. You have the chanson de geste, these deeds of the great kings. You have Arthurian romances. You have chronicles and annals and these obscure letter collections. Hagiography, the lives of saints that use this overly symbolic language. That and many more. There's so many different kinds of texts, and none of them look like what we would call a military manual. None of them look like a Clausewitz on war. They don't look like that. And in those texts, like you do with Polycraticus, with John of Salisbury, you have to dig inside them to find this stuff. So it's very opaque. And because a lot of these texts have not been translated into English, it's very difficult sometimes for non-specialists to go in and to plumb through them, right? Your Latin should be good, and it can't be classical Latin because medieval Latin is very different. It could be harder to read in some cases. So you have to have the right language skills. You have to know where to get a hold of these books, and you have to go looking for them. So one of my projects that I've been working on is to try to get scholars to put at the forefront what they've found in these different sources, the different kind of military advice that's out there. And it's there for every quadrant of Europe, for North Africa, and for the Middle East, for all the periods. You see there are works of that we would call military manuals today, but they're by and large unknown. And so that's the reason I think that John has sort of labored in obscurity for so many centuries. But the more we talk about these kinds of sources and the more we bring them to light, the more we can talk about the connections between the Middle Ages and the modern world. And the argument is not that the Middle Ages by themselves have some kind of spectacular, amazing thing that you must pay attention to. Instead, it's that it's an intellectual progression. There's a tradition in terms of martial writing, and it didn't take a break in the Middle Ages. It continued along a path. The thought developed, with John just being one example. And if we look for those other authors and sort of fill in the canon of the great medieval authors, we can tie together Vegetius and Machiavelli and kind of fit in the 1,000 years in between. And wouldn't that be a great thing for historians of strategy, for historians of military affairs, and for the interested public in general, opening up the past to showcase what's there. There, I will conclude my lecture, and I am pleased to take questions and answer if you want to send them into the email address I mentioned, dolesocial@ku.edu. And before I take those, I'd like to just throw a little advance notice for the next of the talks in our series, which will be given by my colleague, Dr. Brian Steed at the Command and General Staff College, who will be talking about a very different period from mine, almost 9 centuries removed, ISIS and the management of savagery. And that will be same time, 3 p.m. Thursday on February 4th, and the same place. So we certainly hope to see you there. And at this point, I'll be happy to entertain any questions that might come my way. All right, I have one question here. Polycraticus, this is the question. Polycraticus sounds a lot like a combination of Vegetius, drill, discipline, melee weapons over missile, and Frontinus, stories, maxims, and exemplars. How did he transcend those sources beyond simply updating the language and context, right? And that's a great question. The idea of how do you know if he's borrowing so heavily from these people, and it seems like he's combining them, how do you then distinguish, right? How is he moving past his source material? And the way he moves past is he usually signals it in his own text. He'll say something like, but it occurs to me that, right? Or as recent history has shown, however, right? There's these kind of markers in the text where you see him departing from it. And that's one way that he'll kind of key into it. Another way is where he just flat out disagrees with the advice, where he says, the ancients tell us this, but that doesn't seem to be workable, right? And he'll actually say no. And then still in more places, he'll offer his own interpretation. So I'll give you a famous example. I wrote about this once. You've probably heard the story about David and Goliath, right? David and Goliath. So David takes the stone and the sling and he kills Goliath, right? And the Bible passage says that David was offered the armor, right? Here's some armor to put on. Here's a shield. Here's a helmet. And David says, no, I don't want them, right? I'm not going to fight Goliath with that, right? John has commentary on this. Most people were looking at this and saying, David didn't need that armor because he had God with him, right? You don't need to wear armor. He's a simple shepherd boy, and that's all that God requires. He'll get the strength from somewhere else, right? John says this is ridiculous, right? And remember, John's a clerk. He's a Christian man. He works for the archbishops of Canterbury, right? He's not saying you don't need the assistance of God. What he's saying is, it's very interesting. He says that David should have trained with armor. He didn't pick it up because he had never used it before. And so he didn't know what to do with it, right? So that was why he didn't pick it up. And then he goes further and he says, we can learn from this. We have a lot of soldiers in England right now who don't train with heavy armor. They're too lazy. They're enjoying a nice lifestyle. They're not training. And as a result, they're never going to be able to wear this armor. And that armor is what you're going to need if you're going to actually defeat the enemy. This army is what you're going to need. So in that case, he takes the advice and he turns it another direction. I'll put my full screen on, right? And that's just one example of how he does this, right? He critiques his sources and he offers his own version on things. Okay? I have another question here. Is there a relationship between John of Salisbury's works and the chivalric code? Right? We think of chivalry and courtesy and the knights and their rules, right? They had various rules of action to live by, right? This used to be the case. People wrote very convincingly for decades, really, about this connection. Remember I mentioned to you that John has that definition of what makes a good Christian soldier, right? So John has this explanation. He says you need to take an oath and you need to be courteous. You need to do all of this stuff, right? And it was thought for the longest time that he's describing a knight. He's describing chivalry, right? And I looked at this and I said, I don't know that that's what he's doing. As I was reading it, I became more and more convinced that this probably was not the case. But I decided to look into it. And so what I did is I went back to all of his Latin references to knights. And I looked at how he talked about those references and how he dealt with it. And I came to the conclusion that it was a wider thing than that he's not really talking about chivalry. He's talking about just Christian martial deeds, how to be a Christian soldier. You don't have to be a knight. You could be a foot soldier. It's all Christian soldiers, not just knights, right? So I think the people who have said that this just applies to knights or there's a connection there, I think they're probably wrong. But what I will say is there's certainly the possibility that material is inspirational, right? That as you look at writings about knights later on, it's entirely possible people had been reading John and had been internalizing those ideas, right? So I'm not willing to say, I don't want to say he has no connection to the chivalric code. He may well. But what I can say is that his purpose was not to define chivalry, if that makes sense. Hopefully that answers your question. I have another question here. What can scholars of military theory draw from Polycraticus that is still valuable today? Right, and that's kind of one of the signal points, right? Is there utility in here? Because if there isn't, right, then it's a it's an antiquarian question almost, right? It's, oh, well, here's an interesting writer in the past, right? I think what you can draw from it is a couple different things. One is if you want to talk about the Western tradition, the tradition of the profession of arms and the development of professional armies. I think John has got to be in that discussion from a historical point of view, right? That is, if you're interested in the intellectual legacy and who suggested what, and in the history of strategy and concepts, where did these ideas come from, right? On a more practical level, I think there is some utility to modern military professionals here, right? What John is talking about, I think, is in some degrees is timeless when he's talking about the soldiers. He's not talking about soldiers who desert or have obedience problems or who disobey because they are bad people. He talks about how soldiers get into all kinds of other things that distract them from their craft, from their profession. For example, he talks about soldiers who they say they want to fight, but they spend all their time in the bars, right? They spend all their time commiserating with the local ladies. They seek luxury. They seek finery. They don't want to exercise. they don't want to practice, right? And if they can get away with it, they will, right? I think there's a lesson there. I don't think he's speaking about just soldiers in his time, but this is something that lots of writers wrangle with. Vegetius wrangled with it. Later writers wrangle with it, right? How do you properly train? And then he also talks about discipline once in the battle. What can you expect from soldiers once the shooting starts, right? People are going to act in certain ways. Some will stand and fight. Some will run. Some will not know what to do. Some will look to their leaders for guidance. He has advice on all of these sorts of things, right? And I don't think that his advice is peculiar or absolutely unique and different from later ones that come along. But what it shows is that these age-old issues with marshaling a lot of men who have not necessarily spent a lot of time together and getting them to do something as one, training them and drilling them, getting them to act in tandem is a difficult thing and a timeless thing. And so I think that's the utility I would draw out from it. And then I think a third tertiary term is there are a lot more people interested in military affairs than just military professionals, right? I mean, this is a guy who is a clerk who works with the archbishops of Canterbury. He becomes the bishop of Chartres, for goodness sakes, right? He's a man of letters. He's a man of the cloth. And yet here he is with this fascination and this reservoir of knowledge about military affairs, right? And I think another lesson you could possibly draw from this is that we particularly, and I know in America we value this, you need all kinds of stakeholders to input about these things, whether you're talking about strategy or policy or martial affairs, or even how you build a military and move it forward. You need to have more than just one view. There's a diverse set of people out there with all kinds of different conceptions. And the more that you can look at the different points of view, the closer you can get and to spanning the gulf between the real and the ideal. All right, another question here. Oh, this is interesting, right? What would John of Salisbury say to a modern soldier? What's the modern version of just take your wages, right? You know, I think what he would say, I can't say definitively. John, his own experiences with actual soldiers was not that great. And you can detect a bias in his writing that informs, frankly, his discussion about regular soldiers. And I'll give you two examples. Well, he was there when Thomas Becket was killed. He was in the room and he ran away right before it happened. Those were knights. So here's some knights of the king who just killed his archbishop. He doesn't like that. And then he tells a story where he's on the road. I think he's traveling to Rheims in France. I don't quite remember. And he gets robbed by a soldier who was, there was a marching army, and the soldier came off the road and robbed him and stole his purse. So John, when you talk about individual soldiers, he does not have a lot of good things to say. I think if he were to say something, if I could imagine the conversation, I think he would hearken back to the line from John the Baptist, right? If you're going to be a soldier, be content, obey the law, right? And you'll be safe. I think that's what he would say to a soldier. All right, another question. Does studying the writings of John of Salisbury provide the modern military professional any value? If so, what? How does it apply today? Yeah, I think I talked a little bit about this already, about the practicality of knowing about creating armies, recruiting people, training them, drilling them, those sorts of things retain a lot of utility for today. And if you read it, a lot of it, I mentioned the familiarity that Machiavelli may have had with him. Frankly, it reads like a lot of things that Machiavelli says, right? But now that you've asked the question again, it strikes me there's another element that might be important here too. John has an awful lot of discussions about the role of the commander and the commander's duties on the battlefield, but also, and this was intriguing to me, the commander's obligation to his soldiers, right? That it's not just a game of, well, I trained you and drilled you and I order you to advance, so advance, right? And if you don't, I'll cut your head off. It's not exactly that. John talks a lot in terms of that are sort of more empathetic. The idea that a commander needs to be around his soldiers constantly so that he knows what they're thinking. He needs to provide a good model of leadership. He needs to get input from the right people. Now, he says you don't share your commander's plans with everybody, You have to keep those tight to the vest because there's always spies. There's always people, the phrase loose lips sink ships, right? You don't want everybody talking out of school with your plans. So there is that inner circle you maintain, but even outside of that, you have maintained a close relationship with your barons, with we would call your subordinate officers today and your colleagues, but also with the men. That the general has to fight in the battle himself. He has to be a personable character. The men have to believe in him, because if they don't, it doesn't matter how well trained they are, they're going to run when things get bad. Right? So I think that's another good practical lesson, thinking about what we teach at the Command and General Staff College with these courses that we have on leadership, right? And on relations with soldiers and with other officers. That's a good thing to think about, that even 850 years ago, a non-military person like John recognized that good interpersonal relationships are extremely important for battlefield success. All right, and I think the Q&A period is up. So I will thank everyone who watched the presentation and say thank you for spending your time with me. I hope you enjoyed the excursion into the Middle Ages, and I hope you'll tune in successive months for the rest of the year, as you can hear some of my colleagues talk about other military theorists from leaving this period and getting into the more modern areas. And I hope you'll find all of those interesting and stimulating. I wish you the best of days. Stay well.
Thank you for joining the Dole Institute of Politics for our program this afternoon. If you are a student and would like to join the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. Our spring schedule will be announced very soon. You can email doleinstitute@ku.edu to sign up for our email list and get weekly updates about upcoming events. If you enjoyed today's program, consider becoming a friend of the Dole Institute by donating to help make programs like this possible. We hope you have enjoyed this afternoon's program. Thank you, and we will be virtually seeing you next time.